Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Lawhorn.
Glad we can see him.
Good morning, everyone.
No, we can't see it.
My name is Peter Lawhorn. I'm the president of the Conrad Hilton Foundation. Welcome to our panel on pluralism, the sine qua non of liberal democracy. I'm thrilled to have with me two eminent panelists, Meryl Chertoff of the Aspen Institute, their program on justice and society, and Larry Kramer, president of the Hewlett Foundation. Welcome as well to our web audience, and you are all encouraged to live tweet. The hashtag is GPF19. Now, I wanted to start with an assertion that it's possible that not everyone will agree with, but I would like to posit that no matter what your foundation's mission, no matter what your individual philanthropic creed might be, there are two meta issues that you should be interested in and active in. Those are global climate and the state of our democracy. Or if you would like, in the broader frame of this conference, the state of our global polity. This may go against the idea that we should all be very focused in the work that we do, and it may stretch our ideas of donor intent. I realize this is a stretch because it's true in my own foundation, and I have both colleagues and board members here in the audience. I want to give just a little bit of context about ourselves. The mission of the Conrad Hilton Foundation is the relief of human suffering, quite a broad issue. We tend to focus on individuals and the improvement of their lives and about the systems around them, but the systems close to them. We have not had a program on climate, and we have not had a program on meta or higher level democracy. I think we're behind the 6,000 foundations that were mentioned earlier today. But we were put to test last November. And I'm not speaking about the November election, but what happened 2 days after that. I had just come back from an international trip. I wanted to get in a visit to the gym early in the morning. So I opened my computer, unfortunately, at 4:30 in the morning, and I saw messages of condolence that were coming into me. And I didn't know what it was about. I realized within a couple of minutes that there had been a mass shooting 5 minutes from the foundation in the city of Thousand Oaks at the Borderline Bar and Grill, where my own daughter had been a guest. We spent that day organizing a victims fund, participating in processions, and going to a vigil for the victims. When we came out of that vigil, I got a text that we were under mandatory evacuation for the fires that eventually consumed a lot of Malibu and of our area. And we were among the 75,000 families that were evacuated then. When we came back 4 days later, we said we wanted to do two things. Both help, provide immediate help to victims, but to look at the upstream reasons for both of these events, one for climate and one about, I would say, the state of relations within our democracy. In the climate arena, we made a grant for 4 cities in California, Berkeley, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland, to work on urban fire and urban heat. And in the area of the shootings, we discussed a number of things. We talked about gun violence as a public health issue. We talked about mental health and PTSD, as in that case it seemed to be one of the major contributors. But we felt a need, particularly since Pittsburgh had been the month before in the Tree of Life Synagogue, to really look at difference and bridging difference and lowering heat and building relationships between people. And we looked to our own mission in this and said, how can we stretch to this? And actually, the answer was fairly simple. Conrad Hilton, when he was alive, was a strong believer in interfaith understanding. In the 1930s, funded a lot of traveling groups of usually about Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism. But I'm absolutely certain if he were alive today and doing this, he would have included Islam and indeed other religions as well. And again, given the impetus of the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting, we reached out to the Aspen Institute, to Meryl's Institute, and said we would like to fund something that would help build bridges, that would bring people together who are not speaking to one another, in this case on the question of religious pluralism, and that would involve or give a model for how everyday foundations, or all foundations, could be involved in building bridges. And our resolve, I think, was increased manifold a month ago with the shootings in New Zealand at the New Zealand mosque. I'd say we're on a journey. It's easier to identify a problem than to really have the solution for it. So I'm glad to have more experienced people here at the panel. I imagine that many of you are further along in this journey than we are, and some of you are also saying, well, it's not our mission, but how can we get ourselves involved? How can we play our part? So I think, let me say that we have two very experienced speakers with us, articulate, provocative, but ultimately, this session is about giving you ideas and asking you to find the way to step up to the situation that we're in. We'd like to get you thinking, what am I called on to do? And where might my philanthropic efforts lead? So with that, and just once again, Meryl Chertoff is the executive director of the Institute for Justice and Society and runs the Inclusive America program at the Aspen Institute, which focuses on religious pluralism. And Larry, before being the president of the Hilton Foundation, was the dean of the Stanford Law School. I think you'll find them both thoughtful and provocative. So Meryl, could we start with you? Could you tell us a little bit about your work and how it addresses challenges to pluralism?
Sure. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you all for being attentive. Since Peter told a personal anecdote, I will start with one as well. Our work is around religious pluralism, and while I've been working in this space at the Aspen Institute since 2011, I can tell you that the situation has not become better, and I'll tell you a story from my own life. Just after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, I was observing the period of mourning for my own father, and in the Jewish tradition, one's supposed to say Kaddish each night for the first 30 days after the death of the individual. Because of the way that the Tree of Life coincided with that mourning period, I was going into synagogues where I had to pass through metal detectors or pass through armed guards. As an adult, and one who lived through 9/11, I'm able to assimilate that. It's very distressing, but I can assimilate it. But when I saw the young children coming in to their religious school activities and realizing that they had to come in under the same watchful eyes, it broke my heart. I know that after Christ Church, the mosques in my community and the after-school activities in our Muslim schools also were conducted under the watchful eye of guardians. And I wonder what that's doing psychologically to these young children and what their fathers and mothers feel. What women who can't leave their house wearing hijab, who have to think twice now before wearing hijab, are going through. And so we're encountering a massive psychic and moral issue that's coming about, which many of us are seeing day to day. So I just wanted to start framing it with that. We've been at this Inclusive America project working on religious pluralism for the last 10 years. And I'm a poster child for people who reach across the aisle. In my case, it was reaching from the center right across the aisle on the question of religious pluralism. Religious pluralism can bring people together and help them identify meaning and purpose in themselves and others. As my colleague Chris Stewart points out, it's engagement across and in full awareness and appreciation of our differences. Before 2012, we thought that religious pluralism was a missed opportunity for building a more robust civic culture. And while many in the funding sector were excellent, about engaging around issues of race, gender, and immigration status, little attention was focused on what for many Americans is a key pole of identity, and that is religious affiliation. In fact, one could say that in our experience we found an allergy to religion. It was deemed by some to be too risky because of the First Amendment considerations and because it was viewed as the province of the right in the culture wars. It was seen through the lens of reflexive positioning on reproductive rights, the rights of gay Americans, and women's social and political rights. But in the years that followed, we found that engagement around the right to exercise religious identity freely and have equal citizenship and equal status as Americans of faith or of no faith requires urgently that we develop an appreciative understanding of our own faith, the faith of our neighbors, and the underpinnings of religious freedom in the Constitution, which did not single out any religion for favored status and created a wall between faith and politics for the protection of both. George Washington's letter to the Truro congregation, a Jewish congregation in Rhode Island, said it perfectly. Now remember, this is George Washington talking about what we now call religious pluralism. For happily, the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, and requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. So that's the language of contract. All people have equal rights to exercise their faith, and in return, they comport themselves as good citizens. The language of contract, reciprocal relationship. Since 2016, it's become clear that the commitment to the protection of religious minorities is not just a good idea, it's essential to continuation of our democracy and freedom. As my mentor Sandra Day O'Connor said, knowledge of the Constitution is not passed down in the gene pool, it is learned by each generation. Some of these tools ought to be provided by public education, but it is not. Some protections must be provided by public safety officials and prosecutors, and although they try, their efforts are imperfect. Much of the work has to be done in local communities, and I saw in Jane's introductory essay, she talked a lot about localism. This work has to be pushed down into the local sector and done by people at all levels, through affinity groups, through youth engagement, through the relationship between local government and civil society organizations. I have, in the last 10 years, seen that there has not been enough of this work done because the philanthropic community has not made a sufficient investment in it. That funding is the oxygen that we need in order to elevate this work to the level that the wonderful work around race and other things that have been divisive in our country, the philanthropies have been wonderful at that, and I'm asking today for them to consider investing in this new form of division. We need to maintain and reweave the social fabric, not just through laws, but through norms. So we heard from Michael Ignatieff earlier today, and I have to admit I'm a huge fan. In his book, The Ordinary Virtues, he talks about two versions of pluralism, the thick version and the thin version. So the thick version is the pluralism that we're going for, which is the robust engagement with appreciative understanding of difference. The thin version is what Ignatieff talked about in his book, Ordinary Virtues, as a kind of a tolerance, a picket fence version of pluralism. That is, we sit side by side by side, but we don't really know each other. And Ignatieff, in the brilliant first chapter of the book, talks about Jackson Heights, Queens, a place which is not far from where I grew up, where people from lots of different backgrounds live side by side, and although around the bleeding edge young people get to know each other, there isn't that kind of robust engagement. And where does that lead? Well, Ignatieff is an expert on that because he was in Bosnia, and he knows that if the right fuel is there and the accelerant is there, if all you do is live side by side by side, there can be combustion. So the issue is otherization versus trust. We're on the side of trust. Where's the authorization coming from? It's coming from grassroots nationalist movement. That's not just here in the United States, that's all around the world. Amplification online and manipulation by charismatic authoritarians. This is the challenge for us. There are anecdotes, not one, but many. Youth, and we see opportunities in the after-school sector and the summer programs like WISE and Boys and Girls Clubs and 4-H clubs, where the kids spend the critical hours between 3 and 7 in the evening. Affinity groups, women and intersectional identity groups, local community groups, and local governments, and there's also a role for the private sector as part of diversity training.
Great. So we'll have an opportunity, Meryl, to come back to those questions of building thick pluralism, of making philanthropy less squeamish. Now, moving on from the religious pluralism frame, Larry, Jane characterized you today as talking about ideological pluralism. Can you tell us something about the role of philanthropy in pluralism today?
Sure. Let me try and frame this with just a couple of observations around the general topic. So the first one is just to recognize the inevitability of pluralism, that this is not a new phenomenon, it's not a new feature, it's not something that we've discovered in the last generation or in the last 20 years or something. It has always been true of any democratic society that's of any size at all. And it was equally true in the founding generation. So we have this tendency to think, no, the problems today are so much worse, they're so much different than they've been in the past. Race is so much harder a definition. They were all white men back in the time of the founding, and none of that is remotely true, at least as perceived by the people in their context. So yes, the divisions have changed over time, but this country was founded on a set of problems which were all about the incredible difficulty of creating a functioning democracy, which was made up of people with different interests and passions and beliefs and divisions around which people were willing to kill each other. And it's important to recognize that. So then the second observation, I think, as we think about this, is actually the solution that was derived in this country that then has been picked up in many places around the world, was to recognize that you needed to embrace that pluralism, that actually the only way you could create a functioning democratic society was to enlarge it so that you took in a sufficient number. This is the famous Federalist 10, right? Madison's famous paper. Take in a really large number of interests and beliefs and passions, and then create a process through which actually the people who live in the society are forced to compromise with each other and accommodate each other. And that is the structure on which the only successful democracies that have ever existed anywhere have survived. And it is the one that we have struggled with and gotten by with for the first 2 centuries plus of this country. Now, the mechanisms for doing that, some of them are formal and institutional, the structure of the government itself, but many of them are just cultural. And it's an education in what it means to be a citizen in a democracy and what your obligations are and so on. And what we are losing today, which is, I think, a little different, is we are losing that culture. And I see that happening on a number of different levels. And the work that we have taken on at the foundation began really addressing the ones that are at the political level and at the national level. And I'll just say one word about that and then one word about philanthropy. In terms of the political divisions, I respect and I think it's wonderful the work that so many people are doing to try and build conversations at the local level and with some notion that we can rebuild this from the ground up. I'm skeptical. I don't actually think it's possible to rebuild from the bottom up. It's too big a country. The divisions are too many. You can't do like family therapy for an entire nation, which is essentially what we're talking about needing to do. And instead, I actually think that the solution to the problems, at least on the political level, needs to be considerably more top-down, which is to say, when it comes to politics, people take their cues from political leadership about how to behave much more than the reverse. And I can sort of back that up if people are we're interested with mostly historical evidence, but if you think about your own experience, so that in some ways, while we do need to do the bottom-up work, which I think I love seeing it, we also need fundamentally to do some top-down work, and essentially to put it very briefly, we need to create space and opportunity for our national political leaders to start behaving like grown-ups again. And that if they start behaving like grown-ups and treating each other like grown-ups and the way we expect grown-ups to treat each other, I think the public at large will embrace that pretty quickly. And we see it on the rare instances today when that happens in Washington, we see the solutions get taken up very quickly.
Larry, let me ask you a question about that, and we'll come back to your phases. I love your optimism about how strong the levers of philanthropy are. In order to incentivize or encourage people to be acting like grown-ups. But there are much larger forces and actors in our society who have actually a vested interest in them bickering.
Yes.
The cable news, for example.
Yes.
So how can we counter that?
Well, so that was the part I was trying to avoid in this opening, which would be a long discussion of the way we're doing it at the foundation, although I'm happy to talk about that. But I do, just for introductory purpose, let's say I view it there are three distinct issues that need to be addressed, and philanthropy has a potential role in all three of them. So the one that I've been talking about now is about the practice of politics. The truth is, as much as I think some people want not to believe it, very few people who go to Congress go wanting to burn it down. It's a terrible job. The pay is awful, the life is awful. People go because they want to do something good. And most of them, in fact, if you get them, hate the situation they're in, being able to do nothing at all. So there are a set of, it's not like bad motivated people, it's just recognizing that there's a set of institutional, cultural, and structural changes that have taken place within politics that we need to disassemble in order to create space for them. Second, we need to fix the information environment, and that's a longer conversation about what our information environment in which the distribution function for information has essentially been sourced out to these platforms who have an incentive and have created a system where at very low cost you can essentially put propaganda out into the world, and we know propaganda works. So we're drowning in a sea of propaganda, and we have to solve that problem. And then third, we have an ideas deficit. So political debates always take place within a kind of overarching intellectual paradigm that itself shifts from time to time. We went from mercantilism in the 18th century, laissez-faire in the 19th, Keynes in the mid-20th, Milton Friedman, or what people now call neoliberalism in the late 20th. And those work for a time. They provide explanations for people. They're not right or wrong. That's the wrong way to think about them. They work as explanations that help people make sense of the world, and they tend to be largely shared, and then the left-right debate takes place within them. And from time to time, changes in conditions and or changes in the ideas happen so that a system ceases to work as an explanation, and we need a new one. And we're in one of those periods now. You can see it. And if you don't give people a better explanation, they drift towards the ones that are available. So in the 1920s and 30s, communism and fascism had a lot of appeal for a lot of people until we developed something else that worked at least in the United States and in much of the West, but not so much in Russia, obviously in Germany and Italy. And we're in a period like that today, and the appeal of Trump and the so-called national populism is that we don't have any better alternative, and the old explanations that have been offered by liberals and conservatives aren't working for people. So we have an ideas deficit that needs to be addressed. And unless we get at those, and philanthropy alone is not going to solve any of those problems. Those are huge, but I think in the way that we often do, we can help nudge some pivotal levers, so that the way I feel about that is, if we do all the things that we can do as a funding body, we may still not succeed. But if we don't, we surely won't. And so we have an important role to play, and I think that's a product for more conversation. Now, the last point I just want to make is that's out in the world. I think we have our own problem within philanthropy, which is many of the things that have taken place out in the society where people are no longer listening to each other have seeped into our world as well. So we're also not listening terribly well, I think, to the ideas that we need to listen to, and the other things that, that we disagree with. I wrote a little essay about this, which was driven by, I gave a talk at my foundation around the ideas part, rethinking neoliberalism, and someone in my staff raised their hand at the end and basically said, well, of course economists thought that way, look at them, by which this person meant they were all white men. And I was kind of taken aback at the moment. What I said was, well, that was of course true in the 1940s when these ideas were developed. The academy was entirely white men, but I promise you today there are economists of all genders and races on all sides of this issue. That's just not, but what I was thinking at the time was that's not an argument. right? That's just dismissing something. And as more I thought about it, I realized we do that kind of pervasively. We dismiss people who disagree with us either because of who they are, like therefore I don't need to listen to you, or because we assume that they really know we're right, and they just have some bad motive, they're self-interested or they're racist or whatever it is. Or we take the worst argument for something and we destroy it and then pay no attention to the other arguments. And these are increasingly common techniques, and I can understand why politicians might do it. I can even understand why journalists might. They're in a very competitive, but in philanthropy, we have no excuse for that. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing contradictory between feeling passionately about an issue and taking the time to actually understand how an argument on the other side might seem reasonable to somebody else. And until you do that, both you don't understand your own argument, you don't understand the other side's argument, you have needlessly increased the temperature all around, and you may be missing out on the places where you can actually find accommodation and move it forward. And that's an individual thing. One last very quick point, which is just I want to underscore something you said at the beginning, which is philanthropy has been able to work for many years on issues because we could take certain things for granted about the stability of democratic institutions and about the nature of the problems we faced. And we can't any longer. So I do believe every single person in philanthropy needs to have both this concern for what it takes to make democratic government work and climate, because these are both issues that are going to just undo whatever else you're doing. And to not address those alongside everything else you're doing actually is fiddling while Rome is burning. I mean, in the truest sense of the word. Rome is burning, and the kinds of issues that we're working on, if we don't recognize that the whole city is on fire now, we're just going to get undone.
Thanks, Larry. Meryl, one of the issues that Larry brought up is propaganda. And we've all been thinking recently about the role of social media in interreligious, interfaith discussions and tensions. And the New York Times had an article, I think yesterday, about Australia and New Zealand really wanting to clamp down on social media in ways that no one in this country has considered. How does social media interact with your work, and what does it make easier? What does it make harder?
I'm going to get to that, but first, I thought I was going to agree with everything that you said, but it turns out that we actually have some pretty significant areas where we don't. And I mean, you know, in the prior administration, President Obama was, if anything, the quintessentially rational man, right, who modeled grown-up behavior. And before him, at least in the space I was operating in, right after 9/11, President Bush went to the Islamic Center and said Islam is not the enemy, and tried, at least in many respects, to make that clear in the domestic policy. So, you know, the idea that the answers are going to be top-down presupposes that there's some sort of a confluence of agreement. And I would argue that actually what we've got now is we've got a kind of a Burger King democracy where everybody wants to have it their own way. And getting to social media, they're being encouraged to think that, because they're able to, there's a great sort going on, and everybody is able to get the ideas that they already agree with amplified online. And so that's one of the big problems, is that there really isn't a consensus now as to what we want, and there aren't grown-ups in the room, because we're all being told that if we could just get rid of this or that other, then we who are the true Americans, or the true Hungarians, or the true Filipinos, that will be able to have the true, you know, insert X country here. And what we fail to appreciate is that we are globally becoming more diverse, and so we're going to have to find a new consensus, and that requires people to say that what's good for the we is not necessarily every minute what's good for the me. And that means there have to be trusted sources of news that people can look to and that are fact-based. And you know, one of the things that's very alarming to me is this retreat from science and retreat from fact, and the idea of the building of a myth. We've seen where the building of national myths lead us to. So the idea of critical thinking is under attack, and critical thinking is something that we really need to bolster. And that's why engaging with difference is so important, and that's one of the things I thought Ignatieff was so brilliant in saying, the role of the university, but this has to come even before people get to university, because some of the very bad patterns are already set by the time you get to university. If you get to university, and many people do not. And then the question is, what are their news sources, and how toxic are those news sources, and are they getting anything to balance it? And there's a challenge that is very important for all of us in this room to be thinking about.
Yeah, so just to make clear, so there's no disagreement on the diagnosis of the problem, and then the question is, how do you want to think about the solutions? So for me, so number one, take Obama as a good example, right? Why was it so difficult to get anything done? As I say, I think there are a set of institutional, structural, cultural changes that have taken place in the nature of our national institutions that need to be fixed. And it's not because there was ever more consensus than there is today. There wasn't. In fact, the ideological differences today are smaller than they have been at many times in the past. What we've lost is the ability of our national institutions to bridge them. And my claim is that's not because of bad people, but it is because of things that we need to address and fix, of which media is one. Second, I am, as I say, just on the localism point, which is, I'm all for local solutions. The fact of the matter is, there are too many problems that can only be addressed at the national level, and they tend to be flashpoints to create controversy. Even in earlier times, when in fact local communities were less interdependent on each other, it was impossible to do that. There were always too many issues that need to be addressed at the national, now at the global level. So unless we solve those problems, you're just going to see that you're not going to address climate change at the local level. You literally cannot do it. You're not going to address most of our political problems and issues. You're not going to be able to come up with solutions for the kinds of things, whether it's national education policy, of which we do need some, or national economic policy, of which we absolutely need some, or military, whatever it is, without having functional national institutions that create space for local stuff to happen.
All right, if part of the skill of pluralism is to agree about disagreeing, I'm going to take it as read that, Larry, you believe in the top-down, and Meryl, you're interested.
I believe in both.
Yes, but let's have a bit more about each of those. I mean, Larry, if everyone came out of this room today thinking top-down is the way to go, what is the way that the philanthropic community could engage in that? What should they do?
Sure. So as I say, number one is to focus on what are the institutions that make it difficult for someone who goes to Congress, say, with a good faith desire to come up with solutions and a willingness to work across the aisle to do so. So there's a set of structures inside Congress which have to do with the way it functions that can actually be changed with support from philanthropy, whether that's rebuilding a budget process or the way committees function or so on. There's a set of external things in the way our politics operates, including things like campaign finance, the nature of elections, not so much gerrymandering for this purpose as things like winner-take-all single-member districts. There's a whole set of things where philanthropy can help generate solutions and build support for them that can actually produce the kind of change that we need to take place in Washington.
And then with the analogy of climate change, some sort of consortium and aggregation of a philanthropic effort?
Yeah, it does. I mean, there's so much need that you don't even need a consortium so much as just people reading and learning about, you know, there's a lot of conventional wisdom that is contradicted by a lot of good research, so it would help if people took a look at the best research out there. But I don't actually think you need a massive amount of coordination because there's so many things that need to happen and so much room for philanthropy to some coordination. Knowledge, awareness of what other people are doing. I mean, Brad pointed to, that's why we funded that initial Foundation Center resource so that people could look and see what was out there, who was funding what needs to be done.
It's pretty amazing that 6,000 foundations are already involved. And Meryl, if we're talking more about the bridge building and the individuals looking one another in the eyes, what is challenging to do about that? And particularly after an election where it seems like if you look at the political side, blue areas are getting bluer, red areas are getting redder, and people are more isolated from one another. How to overcome that?
So this is one of the areas where we really do have some wonderful opportunities to create the opportunities for encounter. And that can come in terms of bringing young people together. It can come in terms of creating these road shows, you know, where people go out and they engage with people who are different. My colleague David Brooks is going around the country on sort of a listening tour as part of what he calls the Weave Project. And I think David is going to be one of the speakers later, and he's going to talk about reweaving the social fabric. But what I really want to zero in on is this problem of otherization. If you keep slicing and dicing it so that everybody is defined out of what constitutes full citizenship, then pretty soon you've got only a very small number of people who are full citizens. And if you look at this, this has been the Trump strategy, right? He never goes over, 30, 37, 38%. And why? Because he's got a core of people who are tremendously committed to his point of view, who are not really concerned about what most of the people in this room will agree are the norms of democracy, about respect, and about listening even to people with whom you disagree, and trying to develop consensus. He's trying to govern with a very small number of people. And there are semiotics associated with it. I talked about my personal experience. There was a time in my life that I wore a small emblem of my faith around my neck. I've stopped doing that. But if you watch on Fox News, the people who are representing the Trump administration and people affiliated with him, some of these women are wearing large crosses. There's a semiotics to that. They are saying this is a white Christian nation. Now, demographics tell us differently, that things are changing, but overwhelmingly, this is still a Christian nation, but it is not necessarily a white Christian nation. And so there is a need for an adjustment by people who are used to being the in-group to take into account dealing with difference and having difference be part of their communities. And that can be difference in language, but that can be difference in faith as well. So while I applaud the idea of doing things at the national level, a lot of these have to be relationship building and building these conversations. And if we have to do it artificially by bringing people to a place and sitting them down together and trying to build what we call the My Pal Al phenomenon, this is Robert Putnam's idea that if you have a friend named Al who is of a different faith, you will not only be more tolerant to people of Al's faith, but you'll have more of a sense of inclusion to people of other faiths more generally. But also, here's an opportunity for social media. There is an enormous opportunity to have young people encounter each other through these kinds of devices, but it has to be done in a modulated and filtered way so that positive messages are coming through. And the Tony Blair Foundation did some great work a few years ago in their Face to Faith program in getting kids from Pakistan to talk to kids in Connecticut and things of that nature. So there are all kinds of creative ways to do this, whether it's in physical space or in virtual space.
And I've got a couple of teenagers at home, and I can't imagine them gravitating toward religious pluralism. How do you make it cool for youth?
I think that young people are naturally curious. They're naturally curious about other people. And, there's like food diplomacy and music diplomacy and hip-hop diplomacy. There are all of these things that are being done globally, which can be done locally too. We have one of our colleagues in this work who is a conservative evangelical pastor who is working with the Muslim community to develop relationships between the pulpits and trying to push it down into the pews as well. But he talks about globalism, which the idea that this all is both global and local, because the world looks at us and we look at the world. And so young people are curious about the world. They want to look past their neighborhoods. And that's, again, that can be an opportunity.
Larry?
Well, so just... So I actually don't want to get bogged down in the national, local. Work on whatever level you want. Just work on this problem.
Yeah.
So that's the Rome is burning thing. What I do want to point out, though, is the idea of trying to divide people based on group identities and so on, just not new. That has been true profoundly all across American history. So the question you need to ask is, why did it take now in such a strong way for 40% of the population, and that's sadly not a small group, for 40% of the population so that they were willing to actually pull the lever and vote for somebody who in every single other respect, frankly, is such an indecent human being? That's a kind of alienation and disaffection that we need to think about. And it's not just because they've been told to think like you're a member of this group and the other is not you. They've been told that, we've all been told that constantly for 200 years. So the question's why it took. And that's the question of these other issues, which is the institutions that are supposed to provide answers for people in their lives have been failing for a very long time. And so that becomes more appealing as an explanation for why my life seems so hopeless or why the future seems so frustrating. And so that's where we need to address it. That's my main contention here, and that those problems do require, at least partly, strong national solutions. They require functioning national institutions. They require ideas that we don't now have about how to think of them, instead of just throwing out at people the same old stuff that they've already rejected on both the left and the right.
And that brings up a question. Who are the strangest bedfellows that either of you works with in this work you're doing?
We work with Meryl. No. We do, actually.
We do, yes. So, well, we've actually had some great relationships with people in the evangelical sector, and not the people who you're reading about going to the White House, you know, who are trying to subvert politics in the interest of religion, and they're being played vice versa, but people who are sincerely evangelical, with whom we may have very substantial disagreements on some issues, but who understand that their own ability to exercise their religion depends on my ability to exercise mine and yours to exercise yours, who appreciate that and who understand that an attack on one is an attack on all. And they have been some of our best colleagues in this. And we have been building these authentic relationships where we understand that we are going to disagree on matters of theology and on ultimate disposition of things, and we may disagree on reproductive rights, but we have some very key areas where we do agree. And so one of the things that's really important is to build those dialogue skills and act like a grown-up and understand that you're not going to agree on everything, just like you don't agree with everybody in your family, but you still have a way of getting through Thanksgiving dinner, usually. So that's another thing that's critical, is to develop that ability to engage with people who we disagree with on some critical things, find the areas that we can agree. You know, I know Katty was talking about her husband. I mean, the brilliant idea of final status negotiations and the idea of there are some things we're going to hold out for the end. We're not going to talk about it until we've built that trust and we've built the agreement on the 80 or 90% of things, like Jane found that she was sitting next to a San Francisco liberal who supported Trump. If you get to the 90% of agreement, then you can hold out that last 10%. And then, okay, now we're going to get to the hard stuff. Let's have that discussion. And that makes it a much more productive discussion at that point.
And Larry, you know, you've said a number of times, historically, we've been through waves before. This is not new. But presumably there have been more positive times as well. What leads to the shift from turbulent times to more coalescence?
Well, as I say, I think the most important thing is people's perception is that to the extent that they're counting on whatever institutions they're counting on to work for them are working for them, even when things are bad. If there's a sense of trust and faith in the institutions and in the people who are in them, you know, people will accept quite a lot and work really hard for it. I find it really interesting to think today, it's like, you know, we're doing this thing, we have this whole exercise plan, like how do you listen to somebody who, you know, strongly disagrees with it? Like, when did that become that hard?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, right? You know, like, and one of the interesting things about the polarization, although it's getting worse, right now it's mostly confined to politics. So people who cannot talk about politics can go to the movies together, have dinner together, go bowling together, for those who still bowl. I'm from Chicago. We bowled a lot growing up. You know, and although it is getting worse, because it will if we don't solve it, but it is a really interesting question. Like, it's not really that difficult, you know, I mean, again, think across your own life. Well, why is it now so much harder to listen to somebody who voted differently than you did than it was when Ronald Reagan was elected or when Richard Nixon was elected?
Is there any part of this issue or topic that people don't want to talk about? Something they don't want to admit or don't want to mention?
Which issue? How hard it is to talk to each other?
Well, that, but just how we can get to a better place.
Do you want to go first?
So there's the problem of tribalism, right? You know, there's an expression in the Middle East me and my brother against our cousins, me and my cousins against the tribe, and me and my tribe against the world, right? And so, I mean, even my dog knew that she had to defend her pack first. So there is a little bit of that, and there's a tension between that notion that we're all citizens together and we all have equal value in a polity, and that notion that, I mean, in the train trolley problem that everybody learns in college, who you're going to rescue. Obviously, as individuals, we have loyalties, but when we come together as a polity, then we need to view it through an equity and an inclusion lens. And that's what's so difficult for people, is you have to have a certain generosity of spirit to be able to make that part of your daily life. And for most of us, and particularly when things get tough and you've got these kitchen table issues, there's a tendency to get very clutchy. And it's hard to be broad-minded when you're thinking about, putting a meal on the table, where your next paycheck is going to come from and whether you're going to be able to pay for your diabetes medication.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything people won't talk about, but I do think there is something that explains. So when I think of the people I know who hold these radically different views, I just think, God, they're dumb and uninformed. It's like frustrating. How can they possibly think that? But then when I or people tend to think about the people they don't know, they tend to assume bad faith. That's why I mean that of course they know I'm right and they have some really bad motive, like I say, racism, self-interest, whatever it is, for holding the position that they do. And that makes it really easy then not to really deal with them. And to me, the reflection of tribalism is that presumption. Right? It's in that sense that at least with political issues, there's such otherness that I can just stay angry about the whole thing. And the question of how we break that down really is worse. And that's where I say, since I'm never going to talk to all those people I don't know, even if I'm willing to kind of accept and live with the people I do know and just the fact that they just don't get it, as long as I'm assuming bad faith on the part of hundreds of others and on the part of the people who represent them in the government. So how do we solve that problem? And that's where I think if we see them treating each other a certain way, I think that can go a long way towards my being willing to do so as well.
Which comes back to the question of thick pluralism.
And of course, I mean, to the extent that we want leadership from the top, you want to model good behavior from the top. I mean, the Prime Minister of New Zealand did absolutely wonderful work after a horrible tragedy to model what a response should be. The leadership from the top here can't be dignified with the term leadership when it comes to reacting to dreadful things that have happened in this country over the last couple of years. And of course, that's someplace where the bully pulpit is really essential and is contributing to the degradation of the conversation.
Yeah, and then we should come back to the social media issue, because that's also a really pivotal. When I think of it this way, imagine it's 1964 and somebody comes to you and says, I have a great story, I want to get out. Lyndon Johnson is running a child trafficking ring out of a pizza parlor. In 1964, how would you have gotten that out? You actually wouldn't have been able to. You could self-publish, but 10 people would have seen it because you wouldn't have had the resources. You could have found extremist outlets that would have published it. The John Birch Society had a paper, the Communist Party had a paper. They would have probably run it, but the only people who would have seen it would have been that small number that went far out of their way to get that stuff. The only way to reach a mass audience would have been through the devices of these mainstream media, which were responsible curators of the news and also the distributors of it. And maybe they leaned a little to the left or a little to the right. I'm actually willing to say they leaned a little more to the left than they did to the right. But for the most part, they were really pretty responsible, centrist. So most Americans were not getting exposed to awful propaganda. Now the technology comes along and I can produce that story myself really cheaply at a pretty high level of quality, and using the internet and social media reach a mass audience. And as that happens, the amount that's invited in goes way up because the costs have gone way down. And suddenly, although most Americans are actually still looking at mainstream media, it's embedded in this wave of this propaganda, which is not so much false news as it is take a fact and distort it and present it in a way that's designed to stoke anger and fear, and it works. And unless we solve that problem as well, it's going to be really hard, even if our leaders begin to behave better, what people are going to be told about how they're behaving. The media is, because that's their source of getting the information. As long as that remains distorted, we got a big problem.
And apparently in New Zealand and Australia these days, they're talking about whether social media should be licensed in the same way that other media channels are. radical.
Right. Well, there's lots of, we obviously need some sort of new solution, but there's lots of options there, and we don't really understand the problem as well as we need to yet.
And the platforms have to start absorbing some of the costs of what they do. They're making enormous amounts of money. You know, I'm a lawyer. There's the economic theory of tort, which is, you know, if you're making a huge amount of money on your enterprise, then you have to start internalizing costs associated with doing that. And the platforms have really had a free rider for a very long time, and I appreciate the First Amendment concerns, but there needs to be some internalization of costs.
Well, great. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. And if you could keep your questions brief, and what's on your minds? I can't see.
We can't see anything because of the lights, so you should just.
There we go. Yeah, sorry.
My name is Sunil Abraham, and I work at the Center for Internet and Society in India. My question is to Larry. Are you telling us, Larry, that it's sufficient to engage with and understand the other side, or are you advocating that philanthropists build ideological diversity into their portfolios? What happens then is, for example, if you're a media donor, some of your grantees will be actively working against other grantees. Thank you.
Yeah, just so I think it's, I'm not advocating, you have to hire people who believe in the work you're doing and do it. So no, I'm not advocating that you have a staff that includes people who actually fundamentally disagree with the work you're asking them to do. I'm simply asking that the people who are doing the work take the time to make sure they actually understand the people who think they're wrong, why and how they think that.
Great. Next question, over here.
Hello, yes. My name is John Wood Jr. I work with an organization called Better Angels, and very much enjoying the conversation. Ms. Kramer, you made the observation that we're not going to be able to apply family therapy towards, fixing what's wrong with the problems of our political culture. And working with an organization that's sort of a leading organization in applying family therapy, just that kind of dialogue, I felt a little bit obligated to speak up. But I think I agree with you, though, that that's not a sufficient means of changing this dramatic problem we have with the national decline in our political culture. But what do you think, what do both of you think about the idea that as a component, as sort of an experiential component of creating a new norm or encouraging new norms in the culture of our discourse, we can apply creative means of facilitating dialogue as a method of bringing people together to instill a sort of movement culture in the direction of depolarization in our broader political society. Because there's so many groups active in doing this sort of thing, so much hunger, I think, for that kind of a transcendent dialogue. What do you think about the possibility of that lending momentum to a broader cultural shift in the direction of dramatically changing the culture of things on the national level?
Should I go first?
I know a little bit about it. So Better Angels is actually a best practice model. And we admire the work that you're doing in fostering dialogue in communities, and as I understand it, bringing together people who have really deep disagreements, and you found a way of moderating those conversations. And those are the kinds of efforts that, if brought to scale, could be impactful in different communities, with train-the-trainer sessions and scaling that stuff out. So from my perspective, that is the type, that is a model of the kind of thing that works.
So, and of course, we support your work. But what I would say is the following. So one is, and I'm all for it, but it doesn't stick as long as then when people go home, they're bombarded by the same signals, whether it's from their media or from what they're hearing from their political leadership. So it's not sufficient. That's point one. But it's not bad. The other concern I have is even if you could achieve scale with work that really requires intensive, I don't see, I've never heard of, my academic career before going to philanthropy was focused around social movements, actually, the conditions for popular government to work. That's always what interested me. And I've never seen a political movement that wasn't built on a substantive issue. not a way to do things, not a process. Even the American Revolution actually wasn't fought for democracy or republicanism. It was what got people going was taxes, and so I'm skeptical about the ability to scale it. Certainly not, at least without much more signaling from the top down and much better sort of presentation of modeling of argument through the media.
Another question?
My name is Neil Ghosh, SOS Children's Village. Thanks, Peter. Right after the day of the Charlottesville, I went to visit, and with a pencil and a paper. I'm not a journalist, I'm a CEO of organization. And I was interviewing random people, white, black, kids. And one of the, I think age-wise, she was around 12 years old. I was asking the same question, what would you do if you're the President of the United States to stop this thing? And one common theme, because I wanted to ask the same question, so I get more or less same answer. One of the common theme of the answer among a variety of age group was education. So I'm kind of combining what you just said, top-down versus bottom-up. I think it is somewhat education also, and I think one of the things I always think about when I have Global Philanthropic Forum and others in San Francisco, we are also missing out a crowd beyond the coastline. So I think one comment I have for everybody, what can we do not just in the coastline in New York and San Francisco, but other in the Midwest. And the second point, Larry, to you also, a question I have is, there are, as much SOS is global, we are looking at program in the United States. What are your thoughts on doing more about foster kids' opioid crisis within the United States, more program, which might be able to build more bridges?
Right, so...
I always let someone else go first while I give an answer.
So education. So one of the things that we're talking about is embedding these basic ideas in the education process, whether it's in public education, where it's always difficult because of First Amendment issues to get to talking about religion in the schools. But you can talk about religion. The ADL has got some wonderful guidelines about how you talk about religion in the classroom without going over the line in First Amendment things. So this can be done in public schools. It can be done in after-school programs. Another wonderful opportunity actually is in religious education, in the Sunday schools and the Friday schools and the Saturday schools that kids go to. These schools have done a terrible job in educating about the other, and that's an enormous opportunity to start bringing some of that multi-faith dialogue into those schools where actually some of the worst ideas get propagated. So all of these are opportunities, and again, we can pilot these things, which then, if successful, can be done in the national level.
Yeah, I mean, so I think clearly education is important and we need to do better at it, particularly around civics education. It's been in steady decline for 40 years. People get very little of it now. What they get isn't very good. So we absolutely, that is actually a focus in our education work. I also think, though, at the same time, when I was teaching at law school, we would teach the students ethics and how they should behave as lawyers, and then they'd go to law firm, and they would experience the way it really worked. And you see that over and over again. I mean, police in the academy are taught one thing, and then when they're in the station house, they learn something else. And it's the same thing for this. So you can teach somebody up through, they finish their formal education, and if they go out in the world and the signals that they're getting bombarded with are, yeah, but here's how it really works, it doesn't matter much. So it's an important, place to start. And I think the most important thing is, from our perspective, you see all these, people don't actually even think democracy is all that important. Well, how did that happen, right? I mean, that is, I'm certain, is very much a product of the way in which we acculturate children through the educational system. Partly so many of them are no longer in public schools, which served that purpose. Partly both public and non-public schools aren't really teaching. When they do civics, they focus on, we have 3 branches of government, and not on the amazing thing to have a democracy and what your obligations as a citizen are to keep it going.
Well, this is a wonderful thing that Justice O'Connor did with iCivics, was to try to get a more active engagement in civic education. One thing that we haven't hit on is the role of popular culture and getting positive messages out through popular culture. And there are people in Hollywood now who are turning to that and are looking at that. And there are some wonderful entertainers from minority faiths that are talking about their own experience and are being critical. And lots of more diversifying of roles, and all of that is good stuff. And you know, to the extent that you can have conversations with people in Hollywood about that, there's a lot of receptiveness to that now, and I think that's another place where there's an opportunity.
And now I think if I could ask the two of you as we wrap to just give the audience one takeaway, each of you, and particularly what do you think that they should be doing with their philanthropy to improve the situation?
Yeah, okay. Well, some funders are already doing wonderful work in this space, and others are interested in entering it. That's why at Aspen this year we're focusing on bringing funders together through the Religious Pluralism Funders Circle, a place where funders can gain knowledge of what others are doing, share information and best practices, connect with each other, and seed collaboration. We think that this is a wonderful opportunity.
So again, I'd say we touched on 4 issues that seem to me, which is, I'm going to add climate back in, even though we didn't talk about it, but it is existential in that sense. The way democracy functions, the way our media function, and the way we are thinking about the relationship of government to society. I think all of you should just be working on that as some part of what you do. So you can pick where it is, although I do recommend taking a little time to learn. As I say, there's a lot of bad conventional wisdom out there. But if all of us are working on it someplace, we'll begin to make much more progress. The amount of funding in this is vanishingly small, given the importance of the problems, and everything else you're working on is going to get undone if these institutions collapse.
And there you have it. Could you join me in a round of applause for our team?